Are you doing this every week? Is it or most weeks? Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they have to get a replacement sometimes, but yeah,
Yeah.
most weeks.
I'm sure I could tap in easily enough. Oh, here we go.
We'll see. This is
We're
your
live.
audition. Okay, uh, Tisha, are we going?
That's what the chat says. Yeah.
The chat says we're live, so that is the arbiter. Okay, hello, welcome, Prospect Weekly Roundup. This is, I think, the fourth one we've done. Last week the live stream didn't work, but this week it does. That's called Getting Results from the American Prospect. I am David Dayen, executive editor. With me is new dad, back from a family leave break. Our managing editor, Ryan Cooper. Ryan, how you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah. Grateful for our generous union negotiated parental leave policy.
Unions, they just work.
They do.
Don't take it from me. I'm management scum. Take it from the member of the bargaining unit right over there. So yeah, boy, this was a jam-packed week. Obviously, the thing we're going to kick off here by talking about is last night's State of the Union address, which showed a feisty, combative Joe Biden, taking it to his presumed and really all but done uh, Republican opponent, Donald Trump, for the longest campaign in recent U.S. history, with the primaries winding down. Ryan, I'm going to start with your take. What did you think of the State of the Union address? Any thoughts there?
I thought it was pretty good. I was definitely kind of on, you know, tenterhooks a little bit at the start. It's like, oh God, is he gonna fall down the stairs and like break his wrist or something? He's kind of shuffling around, but um, as far as the content of the speech, I would say it was like 90% like pretty great. It was well written, and as far as especially like the expectations that have been set, by Republicans and the media, um, I think he smashed it out of the park in that sense. I mean, he sounds old. He is old, and there's no getting around that, but he was coherent. He just had a couple of stops and stammers here and there, but it was like clearly a guy who's still in like possession of most of his marbles, in contrast to the stuff you see from Trump pretty frequently, where he completely loses his train of thought, or he's just like mangling sentences entirely, and you're not even sure what he's talking about. Um,
I thought it was interesting that Republican influencers and opinion leaders are now pivoting to say that Biden was on speed. That's what got him through the speech, which is actually really amusing considering the revelations that the White House office that dispenses medications was just a speed factory during the entire Trump administration, that they were giving out drugs willy-nilly to anyone who wanted them. So it's yet another every statement is a confession kind of situation on the part of Republicans.
Yeah, I think that um, it was telling how annoyed Republicans were at the speech. They were saying, "Oh, it's too partisan. Oh, they're attacking Trump. This isn't dignified." And it
Right,
was
right.
just the most.
The hallmarks of dignity were saying that people who uphold the dignity of the office.
Yeah, and that it was just it felt like they're grasping at straws that they made a mistake. I think that they said it's all about that expectations game,
Yeah,
and they really whiffed it, or maybe they were drinking their own Kool-Aid in terms of their own propaganda, thinking that Biden actually is like completely demented and
right.
unable to talk. Like, no, he's still just a really old guy, but he's not. Totally lost it either.
Well, yeah. Two things on that. I mean, the if you watch the C-SPAN feed, which had hot mics all over the place, uh, after the speech ended, Biden spent like well over a half hour just kibitzing with people in the room, and you could hear almost everything that he was saying. It took so long that they actually gavelled out the session and turned the lights off while he was still in there just holding court. This is not, someone that needs to go back to the home. So that's one thing. Two, I want to talk a little bit about the content. So,
Yeah.
the speech begins with a really rousing defense and call for the defense of Ukraine, which, I've seen a lot of these State of the Union speeches. There's kind of a formula where you start with domestic policy because that's what Americans care about mostly. And then you move to the foreign policy stuff near the end. And this speech followed that trajectory, but except for in the very beginning, it starts with this defense of Ukraine. And it sort of weaves that into this kind of talk about protecting democracy from threats at home and abroad. And so he sort of tied that to also, this, the January 6th attacks and the loss of constitutional rights, like the right to abortion. It was kind of an interesting way of kicking that off with, a bunch of different seemingly disparate elements, but he tried to mold them around a theme. So I thought that was one thing to note. The second thing I want to talk about is, the part of this election that actually is going to be the most important for people's lives going forward is the part that has been very little remarked upon in the run-up to the election, although Biden put down a pretty strong opening bid on that. And that's the question of taxes. So, in 2025, the Trump tax cuts, which passed in 2017, all of the individual tax cuts practically expire, which means that the job of the next president is going to be to figure out what to do. Are you going to let all those expire and use that money for some other purpose? Are you going to extend them, which the cost of which would probably be something around $2 trillion over the next decade? Are you going to harvest that $2 trillion in savings and apply it to some other policies that you want to do? Or are you going to use this opportunity to rethink the entire tax code? And that's kind of where Biden landed with his opening bid. I mean, I don't think all of it would ever be put into place, but the opening bid included a tax on billionaires of 25%. It included raising the corporate minimum tax from 15% to 21%. Included, I think, increasing the overall corporate tax, the nominal tax, at up to 28%, and a number of other features that really showed a fairly progressive tax policy. I believe he said $3 trillion would be gained through his envisioning of this tax policy. And something I know that you've talked about a lot is the fact that there's still this allergy in the Democratic Party to go below a very high threshold on individual taxes. Biden once again said the line that nobody making more than $400,000 a year would see any change in their taxes, which is a fairly high number. I think it's 95 or 97% of the country, maybe even higher than that. So what are your thoughts on, two things? One, the tax plan itself that he laid out, and two, this sort of larger issue of rejecting kind of the broad-based taxes that we see in, the Nordic countries, et cetera, as a way to pay for services.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, if you could get what he proposed through, I think that would be great. That'd be the most progressive like tax policy change since I don't even know when. Maybe the
1917,
yeah.
the institution of the progressive income tax.
Yeah, I mean, it's not Roosevelt dialing the top rate up to 94% during
Yeah,
World War II, but
sure.
yeah, I mean, I think the problem, it's not just about money, like the problem of feral billionaires has become increasingly apparent. The Elon Musk and people like that in Silicon Valley so many of whom have not only gone, it seems like floridly insane. Their money, perhaps. Here's my cat.
Yes, I see the cattail here
Uh,
making an appearance. The first of many, I think, on the Prospect Weekly Roundup.
but yeah, the money I think has helped drive them nuts. But
Hmm.
take that money and use it to radically influence the political system. I mean, Elon Musk buying up Twitter. That was and still is to some degree a highly important medium of communications for the whole political system. Um,
Yeah,
I do think, $3 trillion, if that's the accurate figure, if that's what you actually got, you could buy
yeah,
a lot of stuff with that. But, I do think that Democrats are going to have to get over this allergy and maybe Americans in general, of thinking that like, well, the only people we need to tax are people making more than $400,000. But, the result of that is that, people like, me and you, like middle class people, end up having to pay for a bunch of stuff out of pocket rather than having it financed by the government. And if
right,
we did it, that way, it would be much more efficient.
right,
We would pay a lot less in healthcare costs and so on and so forth.
right. I mean, you would see that national health expenditures, if they go down, it doesn't really matter much if you're paying that less amount of money to the government or to a private insurance company. You know, if they're going down, they're going down. So that's one thing I'd say. The another way you could look at this is that one thing that the Reagan revolution did was it didn't necessarily cut taxes so much as it shifted the burden of taxes downward. So, Reagan he cut the top tax rate from 70 to, I believe, 29% by the end of his term. But he also had tax increases, like the increase in the gas tax and some other things, increasing the amount that unemployment can be taxed, for example. We have a book review coming out in our next issue by David K. Johnston. The book was by somebody else, but he wrote the book review. And what he mentions in that is that if you look at the reductions of the Reagan tax cuts, they were about 2.9% of the GDP. If you look at the increases that Reagan did, they were also 2.9% of GDP. It's just a matter of who pays. And so you could kind of, if you wanted, see this rebalancing as a way to restore that balance that we had pre-Reagan, where the burden is returned to an equilibrium that we saw before that time, where the rich did pay more, and you're just changing the curve and making it more progressive. So I buy that to an extent, but I do think, like you do, that at some point, if you want to pay for services, if you want good services, everybody there's just a limited amount of returns. There are only 1,000 billionaires, right? You increase the billionaire tax rate, that's good. And his claim is that by raising it to a minimum tax of 25%, up from the effective tax rate currently of 8%, that you would get about $500 billion over 10 years. That's great. $500 billion is not going to finance single payer healthcare, right? I mean, there is limited returns there.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing I'd say about tax policy on my end is that, I would say when it comes to billionaires specifically, the rate should not be intended to collect money. It should be intended to prevent the existence of billionaires. Uh, that's what it was back in World War II. It was like 94% on, if you do the math, something like income
Right,
of $2 million a year. And so if you basically can't make more money than that. And
right,
if you want to break up these vast oligarch pools of wealth, that necessarily means you're not going to get any money out of it, because the point
right.
is it's a sort of, taxing something out of existence rather than trying
Like a
to.
maximum wage, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
that's what I would support.
right,
But then you're going to have to go down into the middle class to actually finance your programs. And
right,
people got to get used to that.
right. I mean, we've certainly seen. I think it was 40 years ago that Walter Mondale was nominated, and he said, "I'll raise your taxes." and then he took, I believe, 13 electoral votes. So we definitely have a lot of work to do to get to your end state there. But I do think there's opportunity in talking about services as a more that are provided more efficiently as actually lowering overall costs rather than lowering overall taxes. And I think if we can get to that place where we talk about it in that fashion, we're going to be in a good place. The other things that were in the speech, there was a call for universal pre-K, which didn't make it in the Build Back Better agenda. There was a call for extending the cap on prescription drugs that is now in place for Medicare to all payers, all insurance payers. So there'd be a $2,000 cap on all drugs per year. There was a lot of talk specifically about lowering costs. Now, I mean, what we see in the country, if you look at polls, is that inflation remains number one, if not the number one, then maybe the number two thing facing that voters see as a big challenge. So we saw Biden talk a lot about his initiatives that he's done through the Competition Council. This cut to credit card late fees that came out this week, for example. This new strike force on illegal pricing, which is co-led by the head of the DOJ Antitrust Division, which we can talk about later, and some of these other things to crack down on illegal and unfair prices. Do you think that Biden is going to be able to make an effective case that, shifting kind of the responsibility here from what is, said by the right is largely a government responsibility for inflation to a corporate responsibility, and one that he is working, actively to prevent?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because it's been so long since we've had to deal with anything like this. I think I have two thoughts. It's funny that he mentioned again something that he's brought up several times out, on the stump speech, the shrinkflation phenomenon. He's talking about how
Yeah.
you get the bag and there's not as many chips in it, and it's funny, it sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's also something that I feel like everybody knows. Like I just bought, a thing of goldfish, for the wife,
Right.
have snacks for the nursing mother, and I'm like, wait, hang on, this is smaller than they used to be,
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
really does actually resonate. It's annoying, and it also it suggests you're being tricked. I mean, you are being tricked. That is the intent of doing that,
Mm-hmm.
to cover up the price increases, and that shifting that burden of responsibility. The other thing I think that is likely to happen, though, who knows, is that once it seems we're basically back down to pretty low rate of inflation. Prices haven't declined, but they're not
Right.
rising the way they were.
Right.
And if you look in the literature on behavioral economics, what tends to happen is like people's have a sort of anchoring about what things should cost, things like
Right.
gasoline and food and whatever, and it just sort of it's sticky, so
Mm-hmm.
people think it's unfair, but that stickiness declines over time. That it's like as the new price is just like the new normal, it takes hold over the course of 6 months to a
Right.
year, and
Yeah,
so
and that'll probably land, barring some sort of, respiking of inflation, that would probably land sometime around, the summer or fall of this year, which is, when people are going to be thinking about the polls. So, maybe that works out for Biden. We'll see. Um, well, I mean, that sort of leads us into the next topic here, which is we had Super Tuesday this week. Super Tuesday obviously yielded 15, I think there were 15 primary elections on the presidential side, and all of them except for on the Republican side, Vermont, and on the Democratic side, weirdly, American Samoa. All other than those two, all of them were won by Trump and Joe Biden, and Nikki Haley dropped out, suspended her campaign this week. So we're back to what I think anyone that was paying a modicum of attention knew was where we were going to be this year, which is with a presidential rematch between a former president and the current president. Any thoughts on at least the presidential level stuff on Super Tuesday?
Yeah, there's two things that I've sort of been keeping my eye on. The first one is that um, Trump has been undershooting his polls consistently in just about every state that I'm aware of. And this, you certainly can't extrapolate too much from that because, it's a primary and it's a barely contested primary. I mean, Haley's there. She was spending some money, but, pretty much everybody agreed it was a lost cause. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, I think, in Vermont, for instance, the overestimated Trump support by like 22 points, and he ended up losing the election.
Yeah,
And this suggests that previously, up through from 2016 to 2020, when Trump was on the ballot, there would be this weird surge of people who, just came out of the woodwork, chronic non-voters who would vote for
right,
Trump and only Trump. Both in 2016 and 2020, the polls underestimated his support. And this
right.
suggests that there may be the opposite phenomenon happening, possibly. But given that how weird of an election a
Yeah,
presidential primary is, you really can't.
yeah. I'd be careful extrapolating that. Primary electorates are notoriously hard to model because you just don't know who's going to come out for a primary relative to a general election. We just don't have enough information. This seemed like a foregone conclusion, especially these races on Super Tuesday. I mean, everyone kind of knew the score. So, Trump losing support because everybody thinks he's going to win isn't necessarily indicative of how he might fare in November.
Right.
Um, Similarly, Biden's support isn't necessarily indicative either because that's also sort of a non-race that's going on. We did see the uncommitted vote in Minnesota
Yeah.
crest even above what was happening in Michigan. Minnesota, I think, was 19% of the vote, and it's going to get a handful of delegates, something like 11 delegates for uncommitted. There are also delegates given in Hawaii to uncommitted. So now there's going to be these actual people showing up at the DNC. And obviously, I think they're going to be primarily concerned about the situation in Gaza, which we don't know what it's going to be like when we get to a convention scenario. The one thing that was mentioned in the State of the Union is this emergency port that's
Oh, yeah.
getting built,
That was,
and which is just sort of a sad scenario that we're now building a port so we can provide humanitarian assistance because an ally wouldn't let us get in humanitarian assistance. It's darkly. I mean, I wouldn't call it comical. It's actually quite sad. Any thoughts on that aspect of it and what we're seeing on the Democratic side and this discontent?
Yeah, that was the second thing I was going to mention was the uncommitted vote. And I think that definitely helps explain, Biden's move. It's been disgracefully late, I would say, but now he is calling for a ceasefire and albeit a temporary one,
Yeah,
and building this absurd, you know, the the Israeli military is not letting us send our aid trucks through with the weapons that we gave them, a lot of
yeah,
police. And you're like, what are we doing here? It's just standing
right.
on our own hands. But I suppose better that than nothing at this point. And hopefully, it's part of a, developing pressure campaign to force the Netanyahu government to um, you know,
Yeah.
uh, stop
Well,
the
let's
war.
let's keep developing it. There was another hot mic moment where Biden was talking. This is after the speech with Michael Bennet, the senator from Colorado, and Blinken, the Secretary of State, and he said, you know, Bennett was just in the region. He was just in Jordan, I think, and Biden says to him, "Look, don't repeat this." This is on the mic. Don't repeat this. I'm going to have a come to Jesus moment with Bibi. I need to do that very soon. And then you see his aide say, "Sir, you're on a hot mic," um, and he's like, "Oh, I'm on a hot mic." And then you don't really hear anything else. But I mean, I think the change in rhetoric does show some of the that the pressure is on. Some people would say it's just a change in rhetoric. There was a humanitarian pause, and now it's a temporary ceasefire, right? What's the real difference there? It's 6 weeks in one, 6 weeks in the other. We'll have to see this develop, and obviously, I think it's going to be ultimately based on results. Nobody is going to appreciate the rhetoric if bombs are still dropping, et cetera. So, we'll have to see how that goes. But I mean, the general election, clearly Biden has made his choice. I mean, you can see it in the State of the Union, right? Like, what is he really going to run on? And I think what was there at the top is probably what he's going to run on, right? And you see this also in that. Did you happen to read the Evan Osnos New Yorker article? That also showed that, look, they're gonna run a race about democracy, and they're gonna run a race about Trump being unfit. They're gonna run a race about threats in the world, like in Ukraine, and threats from Russia. And they're gonna run on abortion, which has been a political winner for the Democrats for 2 years. I mean, it's pretty clear that that's it, right? Those are going to be the main highlights.
Yeah. Yeah. He also mentioned IVF. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah, right at the front, like really early.
I think they must have some polling on that, because Republicans are running scared. In Alabama, they passed a bill that was very curious that legalizes IVF, but the way that it does it is basically say that it's legal to kill an embryo if it's in the
Yeah.
IVF process. And they're like,
Man,
what?
if I'm a mass murderer, I'm getting my medical license and moving to Alabama, because I can do anything apparently as long as it's tangentially related to IVF. There's nothing stopping me.
And I mean, first of all, it's like a farcical law, but you wonder if this would survive judicial scrutiny from the Alabama Supreme Court. It's like, can
Right.
you legalize the murder, of a constitutionally protected class of citizens? Like
At least according to their constitution,
yeah, right.
their rulings. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, clearly that is going to be a major factor. He had not only an IVF patient, but Kate Cox was in the First Lady's box last night. She was the woman from Texas who had a procedure that she needed to save her life, and the ruling hordes in Texas, the Star Chamber decided that she would not be allowed to essentially save her own life with a practice that would damage a fetus. So this is going to be part of the conversation for between now and November, certainly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you know, I was just pondering the IVF question specifically, because I think it's a good place to like push the sort of public discourse, um, the intuitions of the public towards like a saner position on this. Because like if a fertilized egg is a human being, then IVF is out of the question. You can't do IVF the way that it's done. And I think most people when they think about that, they're like, well, it's not a human being. Not most
Yeah.
people, I think, because it's a fertilized egg, a single cell or a handful of cells. It's not a person in the same way as a, actual baby. Um, and so I think
Yeah.
that this could begin to move people's thinking, the certain squickiness that a lot of people have about abortion. I think reinforced by decades of propaganda that like all abortion is a live, infant.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if it's a person, how come you can freeze it? That's kind of strange.
Right.
You can't
Right.
freeze
Yeah.
normal people.
The polling I've seen is 80-20 and above
Yeah.
for in favor of IVF. It's a pro family situation, and I don't think the pro life groups are going to let let the Republican Party off the hook on this. Without question, they're saying this. There were attempts to get the Alabama governor to veto that bill by the usual suspects, the very militant pro-life groups. Anytime the Republicans are going to try to moderate on this, their right flank, their theocratic right flank, is going to attack them. We appear to have a question here from Lauren. So I'll read it out and maybe we'll get a reaction here. Politico reported no labels is moving forward with a presidential campaign, even though they don't have a candidate. What are your thoughts? Ryan, I'll let you kick off that.
I mean, I would say that this is a rat fuck campaign to help Trump. I don't know if it isn't, I don't know how they would possibly behave differently. Just
Well, it's
trying
a
to.
bit of a bumbling campaign, right? I mean,
Yeah.
everybody that they've asked, that they've targeted as their shining star candidate, has said, "There's no way I'll be a candidate for you," right? So it started with Mitt Romney. He was like, "No, I'm not going to serve on a unity ticket." Larry Hogan was the next guy. He's like, "I'll try to run for Senate in Maryland." Good luck with that, Larry, by the way. And then Joe Manchin was asked. He's like, "Leave me out of it." Kirsten Sinema, who left. We are now done with the Manchin cinematic universe. Sinema left, said she would not run for re-election in the Senate this week. She was asked about no labels, said no way. Where are they going to go to find a candidate? And if they have to like sort of scrape the bottom of the barrel to find somebody, the question then is, will this matter at all? This attempted rat fucking campaign. They're even saying now they won't be in certain states. So what seemed to be this well-funded effort is in search of anything to justify it.
Yeah, what are you even trying to accomplish at that point? And I think that, normal, the reason why you could offer somebody like Manchin or Cinema or whoever to serve in this capacity would be okay. Then later I can cash out because they're not going to win, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But like if you've you're going to run like this, the chances are good you're going to end up pissing off both sides.
Right.
Possible, you could possibly, you take more voters from Trump, from people who don't want to vote for Biden, but they really don't want to vote for Trump either. And so, you
Right.
just sort of throw your vote away on
The
whoever.
the dual haters, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I mean, and obviously there's already another option out there for those guys, and those are the sort of rogues gallery of other folks who are running. We had this spectacle of RFK Jr. this week, responding to allegations about, not allegations, but he's admitted it, that he's been on Jeffrey Epstein's plane, by saying, "Look, I knew a lot of guys in New York. I knew Harvey Weinstein. Bill Cosby was at my house." I'm not even making this up. This is literally verbatim that he said. Bill Cosby was at my house. O.J. Simpson, he name checked. I mean, he tried to find maybe the worst people in the world and said, "Yeah, well, look, I have a lot of weird friends." So I'm not sure that's going to wear well with the electorate. Apparently, I'm breaking up a little bit, so I'm going to let you talk next, Ryan. Any other thoughts about Super Tuesday? Maybe talk about the down ballot races.
I'm not sure which ones did you have in mind? I didn't have any.
Uh, well, I'm here in California, and we had, there were 5 states that initiated their primary races with this election on Tuesday. Actually, we'll not start in California. We'll come back to that. I'm going to talk to you about North Carolina and North Carolina's governor's race,
Oh God.
which yielded yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, the what's his name? The former lieutenant governor,
Yeah, Robinson, Mark
Robinson,
Robinson.
and so he's a black guy, but appears to have about the severest case of right-wing boomer Facebook brain that I have ever seen in my life. Um, Hunter Walker did a piece coming back through his Facebook page like 10, 15 years at Talking Points Memo. And basically he went from a sort of like Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, Teacott type of guy to a Holocaust denier and saying a whole bunch of incredibly racist stuff about black people. The profoundly strange, but the type of person who exists apparently. And so he's their nominee for governor in North Carolina, which is, a 50-50 state pretty much. But Republicans have gerrymandered the legislature and the congressional district boundaries so much that they're going to win those overwhelmingly under the current maps. And so even if this guy loses, the Democratic candidate is not going to be able to do anything. Um, yeah, in California, there's the big
Yeah, I'll take that up. Can you hear me now?
yeah.
Right, do I sound all right? I'll ask our behind the scenes Tisha Maveron, ladies and gentlemen, is behind the scenes. She puts this all together every week. Hopefully I sound okay. I'll hear from her if I don't. But we did have a question from Mark, who asked about the influence of money in the California Senate race. So we can start there with the Senate race. California is a nation state, 39 million people. I think the voting registration number is about 20 million. And it's not a state that you can go door to door in if you're running statewide. It's a state where money talks and name recognition talks. And so you had Adam Schiff, who practically is a co-host on MSNBC. I mean, he's on there every 10 seconds. He was the impeachment manager for Trump. He's gained a lot of goodwill among, normie Democrats for fighting that fight. And so he had the name recognition. And then he had about $50 million between him and his allies. And the third variable in California is this top two primary. So everybody gets the same ballot with all the Democrats, all the Republicans, all the independents on the ballot. And you get to vote for one. And then the top two, regardless of party, advance to the general election. And if you're in a blue state like California and you're the front runner, you want to make sure that you're running against a Republican, because then November is going to be easy for you. If you are running against another Democrat, you have a battle on your hands. And so Schiff, and he's not the first person to do this, and he won't be the last as long as we have this stupid top two primary, elevated Steve Garvey, the baseball player, who didn't run a single ad on his behalf. He did not campaign to a large degree. In fact, there was over the previous weekend, GOTV weekend, there was an article wondering where he was. Like nobody knew where he was for a couple days. And yet he jumped into second place, almost first place, by consolidating the Republican vote. And the way that he did it was that Adam Schiff ran Steve Garvey's campaign for him. He essentially ran two campaigns. He ran his own, and then 60% of Schiff's ads from either Schiff or his super PAC or other allies mentioned Steve Garvey. And all of them were like in this leading tone, like Steve Garvey is too conservative for California. He voted for Trump twice. He's gaining in the polls. We have to stop this too conservative person. And then they ran them on Fox News, where Schiff has said it is despicable to run ads on Fox News. We're giving money to this right-wing propaganda. So, but his allies ran these ads on Fox News. And so what this had the effect of doing is boxing out Katie Porter, who was the third place finisher, who, might have had a shot in a general election, especially because of the weird way that in a Dem on Dem race, whoever's the most prominent Democrat, Adam Schiff is hated by the Republicans. The Republicans would have probably voted for Katie Porter in California, just because she's not Adam Schiff. And so she would have actually had a chance to win in November, but she was boxed out, and Barbara Lee as well was boxed out of the primary race. And this is perfectly legal, but it's really cynical. It's really sleazy. And there's a debate over whether this will hurt Democrats down ballot in the House races in November, because you'll have a contested primary or contested general election in the Senate race at the top, and that will bring out Republican votes. I'm not so sure about that. But anyway, I think that this was a really whack campaign tactic that, is a function of the top two. And it's a function of the lack of campaign finance reform, that one person can run essentially two races on their own. So we have a question from Margaret, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ryan. But Margaret says, does Katie Porter have a future? Her giving up a House seat is a terrible loss. I think Katie becomes now a prime candidate if there is a second Biden administration. She has the experience to go into various consumer protection roles in that administration. If Rohit Chopra decides to move on at the CFPB, you could see Katie Porter at the CFPB. If there's a spot on the Federal Trade Commission, you could see Katie Porter at the Federal Trade Commission. There's an administrative role probably to play for someone like this who has a following, especially when, in a second term, there's usually a lot of turnover in those roles. So that would be my answer there. Any thoughts, Ryan, on this Senate race here in California and the insanity of how it played out?
Well, I mean, I guess it goes to show you the importance of like institutional design and like shaping the behaviors of the politicians. It's like the sort of emblematic of the Senate itself. If the Senate didn't exist, the country would work in a much different fashion.
Right.
The other thing, I mean, $50 million on a Senate primary. I'm struggling to recall like what it was like 2004 presidential election. I think the
Right.
each candidate spent on the order of something like that. I mean, just the amount of money in politics these days, it just keeps going up and up and up. And it
And
goes,
this is why Barbara Lee, who had, she was kind of alone on this message around foreign policy and Gaza in particular. She had $1 million. There was just no way that she was going to be able to get her name recognition up, despite having a policy that maybe a lot of Democrats would have agreed with. There was just no way she was going to be able to compete. And Porter had about 18 million, 20 million, something like that, and just Schiff blew them away. And is this kind of gets back to my story that I did for the last print issue? Is this a democracy when money is so determinative to such a degree? But I will give some hope on that. There was a race where money didn't talk totally. And it's Katie Porter's old seat, the California 47th congressional district. This was, again, a top two primary. But there was essentially one Republican and two Democrats who were, the main challenge. There were other people in the race, but, in terms of viability, there were two Democrats and one Republican. And the two Democrats were Dave Min, this guy is a state senator in that district, and Joanna Weiss, who's a first-time candidate and an attorney. They don't really have different opinions on Israel. Their messages are broadly similar. Neither of them have called for a ceasefire. Both of them have sort of resisted the idea of conditioning aid to Israel on various factors. But Min has been a little bit more critical of Netanyahu and a little bit more critical of West Bank settlers. So as a result, AIPAC's PAC decided to spend $5 million, close to $5 million, I think $4.7 million in this race. This is a congressional district. That's a huge amount of money for a primary in a congressional district. They ran all attack ads on Dave Min. They had nothing to do with Israel, predictably. Dave Min actually got a DUI like a year ago, and they were all about this DUI that he got a year ago, which he's talked about, and obviously is a huge mistake and kind of ridiculous. But almost $5 million to attack Dave Min in this election. Dave Min ends up winning. He beats Joanna Weiss, who obviously was not a ready for primetime candidate if she can't win a primary with $5 million against her opponent on a pretty credible attack on a DUI. I think this is really interesting. AIPAC has talked about spending $100 million in the primaries, and their first one out of the gate, they must have got some polling that showed them they could win this. Or maybe they were just trying to damage Dave Min because they like the Republican. That's certainly a possibility here. The Republican is, a usual four-square pro-Israel guy. So maybe that was the case. Maybe it was just to weaken him or to send a message to pretty much every other Democratic candidate that you can't even talk a little bit about Netanyahu, or we're going to come after you. But for them to lose this race when it seemed like a layup, I think, it speaks to their political resonance a little bit, at least in this one data point. Now, maybe, Min was experienced. He had won a race down there. Certainly there was an imbalance between his political experience and his opponents. But, $5 million to beat that's saying something.
Yeah, it was pleasant to see. And I don't know, it's something that occurs to me every now and then, as somebody who's not Jewish. It strikes me as like slightly ill-advised for a sort of, Jewish, like, Zionist organization to go around spending money in like dishonest ways, not mentioning the thing you're actually trying to influence, to like stack the government with like your particular partisans. Like, isn't that a little bit
and then there's the combined fact that almost all of the money ends up going, not every time, but the vast majority of the time, the money ends up going to attacking people of color. That was true in this race. It's going to be true down the road with Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. Not the greatest look to have a bunch of rich guys, a lot of them tied to Republicans who have been Republican donors forever, just willy-nilly attacking people of color who are trying to represent their districts. Not the greatest look in the world.
Yeah. Do you want to talk
right.
about this antitrust thing?
Yeah, let's get into this. And we have about 10, 15 minutes left, so this will probably be the last topic. I'll just once again say, if you have other questions, please throw them in the chat. But yeah, so early this week, on Sunday night, the appropriations committees released what they call the minibus. So what that means is that there are 12 annual appropriations bills. We've been waiting for months. They've been doing continuing resolutions to fund the government. But then they put out this week it's not an omnibus, because it's not all 12 bills mashed into one. It's a minibus because it's 6 of those bills mashed into one. And they did end up passing that. I think it's going to pass the Senate today. But they released this on Sunday night, and in looking through it, I think it was Matt Stoller who was the first one to catch this. The antitrust subdivision, the antitrust division of the Justice Department, was their budget was slashed by close to 20% from the expectations, and it was kind of worse than this, because what they did was, there was a bill that passed at the end of 2022 called the Merger Filing Fee Modernization Act, and what that did was it said, we're going to increase merger filing fees. And then the antitrust division, which has to deal with reviewing mergers and challenging mergers, would get to keep a larger portion of those filing fees, so that if there was more merger activity, they would have more money to deal with that. So what this bill did was say, well, this law that passed, and by the way, the Senate passed it 88-8. So this was a broadly bipartisan bill. The Appropriations Committee, which is made up of a bunch of process nerds, said, hey, you didn't go through us for that appropriation, no fair. Even though it's the complete will of the Congress, we're going to cap that number at a lower number than what you expected you were getting, about 20% of a cut. And we're going to say, we're going to take, you're not allowed to use any more than the cap that we put in on those merger filing fees. The rest of it will get thrown into the Justice Department budget. And so, we wrote a piece on Tuesday explaining this whole thing. We wrote another piece showing that members of the Appropriations Committee are very tied to big tech. Members of the staff, 19 of them, former House or Senate Appropriations Committee members, are big tech lobbyists now. So, I mean, do the math. Who benefits from the DOJ Antitrust Division having a lower budget? It's large corporations. So a lot of people had an interest in this. And even though it seemed like a turf war, like a process situation, you can't help but think that there was probably a call made to the Appropriations Committee that said, hey, it would be nice if you reduced the budget of this very effective organization, the Antitrust Division. So what ends up happening is that last night, a lot of pressure being put on the member of the subcommittee, Jeanne Shaheen, senator from New Hampshire, who cut this deal with the House. A lot of pressure put on her. And she goes out onto the Senate floor and she says, okay, to some of her colleagues who have been agitating against this, there was a letter from 31 members of the House and Senate, and also even some Republicans saying, we demand that you restore these cuts. So Shaheen comes out and gives a half measure. She says, we'll work to restore them in 2025, not this year, but in 2025. And this won't be a permanent taking away of the ability for the Antitrust Division to use these higher filing fees. So they would restore what has been the practice since 1989, which is if more fees come in, then the Antitrust Division can use them. So this was sort of a half measure, but it's not enough. I mean, the 2024 budget is still going to be slashed. And there is a chance now, however, with the second minibus. So there are still 6 bills to fund the government that haven't passed yet. And they could put a rider in the whatever mechanism is used to deal with that. They could put a rider in saying, okay, we reverse these cuts for 2024. And so that's, I think, still going to be a live ball. But it is interesting that, what was just this thing tucked into the bill became this wider issue, in part, pat ourselves on the back, in part because of what we wrote. Such that the senator had to come out and say, "Okay, we'll back down." So one thing it goes to show you is that when you're talking about these large bills that then get thrown upon the House and Senate to pass in a matter of days, it's very, very easy to tuck in special bits and pieces to favor, donors, or to fight internal battles, or however it happens. It happens, and it happens a lot, and we should be aware of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't really have much to add to that, narrative wise, but I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that it's a really good illustration of the dysfunctionality of the American legislative process and how it's gotten a lot worse over the last couple decades. I mean, just as you say, the fact that so much legislation, just the ordinary business of government, not like new legislation, like, oh, we're going to build up a new agency to study this or do that. It's like just funding the regular government that we already have, stuff that is just like absolutely routine, in any kind of parliamentary democracy. It's just a hair on fire emergency every time. And the only way that it happens is you have this monster bill that it usually comes at the very last second when it's going to cause a government shutdown, and it's stuff full of God knows what, because it's like 900 pages long, even the little ones, and you have to rely on Matt Stoller happening to like read through a PDF in the middle of the night to notice like, oh, these the cat's paw from the tech industry has come in and like snipped away at the little funding formula that works in a very complicated fashion for the antitrust agency. Is like, this is no way to do sort of democratic deliberation.
Absolutely. That is absolutely the right takeaway. I mean, when was the last time that the Congress passed all 12 annual appropriations bills on time? Like, you can't remember. There is like, it is not in the recent memory that has ever happened. And yet we continue to have this process. We are talking about, with this bill, the funding of fiscal year 2024. That's this year. It was supposed to happen at the end of September. It is now March. So we're almost 6 months away. And we're still talking about this year. Next year's budget has the same deadline, and we've already wasted half the year talking about last year's budget, right? So it's a dysfunctional system, and it does facilitate these kind of tricks and traps. We actually have a piece on the Prospect website today about another provision that was tucked into this bill, which transfers 10% of the CHIPS budget into one facility that Intel is putting together, but that is, they call it a secure enclave facility to produce sensitive chips for the U.S. Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense has said, we don't need this. Like, chip fabrication is already very sensitive, very, very secure. And we think this would be counterproductive. There's an actual Air Force report that says building one secure enclave facility would actually harm readiness by creating a bottleneck. And yet somebody managed to slip this in to this big bill, giving Intel $3.5 billion to create this facility that even the agency of the government that would benefit this says it doesn't really need. So there you go, right?
Yeah, it's a little absurd. There's things and obvious steps you could take. One of them would be to eliminate the filibuster. I think that's probably the primary bottleneck, so that you could pass bills normally through the Senate with 51 votes. But
I mean, certainly that would be a benefit, but we'd still have this problem.
Oh yeah, The fact of divided government is probably the biggest one. The fact that
there you go.
A legislature controlled by two different parties, that's crazy. That's just like,
we don't see that a lot elsewhere. As I wrote about in the democracy issue, there are 4 countries on Earth that have the features of the U.S. of a presidential system, so that the head of state is not the head of the legislature. So you have that separation, and also a first past the post system for the legislature, so it's not proportionally represented. There are 4 countries, the U.S., and 3 countries in Africa, like Ghana, Sierra Leone, and one other country. Every industrialized country in the world uses a different system than ours. And we wonder why there's dysfunction in our government. We are not taking up the experiments of the world in terms of how to efficiently create a working system of government. We are the oldest and therefore the best, although it doesn't always seem to work out that way. I think we can leave it there. Ryan Cooper, managing editor, Prospect, thank you so much for coming on the weekly roundup. Also, you plug away. about Left Anchor. You're an experienced in the ways of audio information dissemination. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, there's a podcast that's on the Prospect website. I, in fact, just put an episode up this morning called Left Anchor. But if you prefer to listen on, your podcast app, you can go to leftanchor.com. There's an RSS link there at the top. Me and my buddy Alexi the Greek, we talk about the news and about, political theory. Our latest episode is talking about George Orwell and nationalism.
No?
And so, yeah, that sounds interesting to you. Pop on over there, check us out. Also on YouTube too, I think. So
Great. All right. Well, we'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel for the Prospect Weekly Roundup. Thank you so much for being with us. And we also tape these, and we will put this up on the Prospect website. You can watch it all weekend long. So thanks a lot.
bye.